A very good evening. I'm Keith de Souza. Welcome to 938 Live's Budget Forum 2014. Quality growth and building a fair and equitable society. That's the continued focus of the budget this year. And these are just some of the announcements Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam made earlier. A $9 billion Pioneer Generation package to provide extra healthcare support to those at least 65 years old this year. Employer CPF contribution rates to Medisave to go up by a percentage point from next January. CPF contribution rates for workers aged 50 to 65 go up then too. Lower and middle income families will get more subsidies for education, preschool to tertiary level. Businesses investing in the productivity will enjoy an extension of the Productivity and Innovation Credit or PIC scheme for another 3 years, with SMEs getting an extra boost from an enhanced PIC Plus scheme. Gosh, there's a whole lot more. And there's a $500 million Infocom Technology or ICT Productivity and Growth Program to help SMEs step up the use of ICT solutions. For the construction industry, certain government and land sale sites will mandate that productive technologies be used, and for property watchers, it's status quo, with Mr. Tharman saying it's too early for the government to start relaxing its cooling measures. But first, it's time to welcome our guests this evening, 3 guests. First, of course, Senior Minister of State for Finance, Josephine, Mr. Gerard who's Chairman at Council for the Third Age, and Victor Tay, he's the Chief Operating Officer at the Singapore Business Federation. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome into 938 Live's Budget Forum 2014. That was a long preamble. Try to put it all in perspective. Mr. Let's start with your thoughts first and foremost. What were your thoughts of the budget 2014 this year?
I think for the people sector, I'm very pleased with it. I was a bit worried initially that with so much talk and focus on the pioneer generation that maybe not enough attention is being given to the lower and middle income population, but that didn't happen. So when the budget speech was presented, first I enjoyed listening to what is being introduced for the lower and middle income, and stretching all the way even for the EPIC program, because I'm involved in some voluntary work that does deal with very little children that benefits from EPIC program. My concern now is whether listeners take the Pioneer package as an additional layer on top of what is being given for the lower and middle income seniors. But if you add it all together, I think it's a very generous package.
And your thoughts, Victor, as generous for the business community? He's smiling.
Well, I think firstly, before the budget, we actually asked most of our members on what they wish for. So most of the businesses were asking for measurements actually help to defray rising business costs, foreign workers issues, levies, and in terms of quota, that there's no further restriction and reduction from
relief.
There. Yes, and the third part, I think most of them asked that if rental measures, in some way, they could actually have more cooling measures to that. With this, I think, announcement we saw today, I think there's a sign of relief that there wasn't a further burden that's been added on, except construction sector. Unfortunately, I think there is a nudge that they move towards a more constructive, productive way of building.
Productive technologies, as they say.
And the other part is, I think the Business Federation has been looking at the more progressive companies and those which are more growing-oriented type, to make sure that there's enough budget measurements for them. And I think in here we see a lot of announcements in this area. Internationalizing activities, the loans for it has been raised from 15 million to 30 million. For startups which are in technology-oriented, which is focusing on research, there's a lot more equity financing put in there, and even mezzanine financing. And for companies who are actually wanting to invest in more productivity activities and upgrading and automation, etc., the PIC Plus has started to actually up the cap from 400% to 600%. So there's a lot for the growth-oriented companies and SMEs to actually smile on. There's always within the ecosystem a small micro enterprises group, unfortunately, and some of those are actually struggling day to day and they are not profiting. And I think where they look at some of this measurement, unfortunately, generally they won't see much of a package to them. They, however, may even see that the 1 percentage point for CPF, 1+1 percentage point for CPF for as added burden, a cost burden to them. While some of these businesses, I think they generally understand the senior workers ought to be actually assisted in their healthcare. But I suppose some of these businesses may look at it and did not see much of incentives back to them.
Well, we hold that thought. I want to get to Mrs. Teo, but I have to ask Victor. Victor, if they can't afford to pay their workers, should they even be in business?
I guess some of these businesses, I must say, they were family-run businesses, and they have actually passed from generations. And I guess where they are concerned, some of them, they have been living through decades across crisis years. In the past, there were Pan-L crisis, there were financial crisis, there were Asian financial crisis, and they survived all throughout, even H1N1 and flu pandemic. I think some of them, they felt perhaps, I think some of the restrictions on policies might be a heavier burden on them, and therefore they might then just raise an eyebrow on it.
Mrs. Teo, so let's address to some of the businesses that may fall through the cracks.
Yes.
Earlier we were talking about something like 100,000 businesses. Victor, with these people who do not qualify for these schemes, what happens to them?
Well, thank you, Keith, first of all, and good evening to all the listeners. It's always tempting to look at every budget on its own, but it's also useful to take a step back and look at this year's budget in the context of some previous budgets. Mm-hmm. And I think the point you made earlier about quality growth and about moving towards even more fair and equitable society are actually broader shifts that started a number of years ago. And there are many programs already in place to try and help us realize these goals, and they are making good progress. So when Victor talks about some of the pain that is being felt in the business sector, I think it is quite understandable that businesses are feeling the pressure from rising business costs and the external environment being challenging. And so I think what we also know from the pace of restructuring is that if you look at it from the point of view of the employees, in fact, you see that real incomes at the median level have risen over time. Mm-hmm. And this has come about because the businesses have to make changes to the way they operate. And only when they do so, they are able to level up their competitiveness and become more productive. And that is the only way that you can sustain rising incomes over time. So this part of the restructuring, while it is painful, it will actually enable the firms operating within our economy to be stronger, to be more dynamic, and to be more efficient. And if we look at it not from the point of view of what happens this year, but what happens in 5 years, what happens in 10 years, then it is quite clear that this transition is absolutely necessary, because we are no longer operating from a very low base. If we want to help Singaporeans to achieve higher incomes, the only way to do it is to keep the vibrancy, keep that knowledge content, and make sure that we are able to do better than firms operating in other countries, in other economies. So that is the forward momentum that we have to build, and we have done so quite well. There are businesses that are struggling, but that is not to say that there are no businesses that are also finding new ways of operating and making good progress. So what we hope to do is to deepen the support for the businesses that are making the effort, they are becoming more dynamic, they are becoming more efficient, and give all the support that such businesses need to succeed and to thrive. So you will see that in this year's package of support for businesses, a lot of it has to do with helping the companies to become more dynamic, more efficient, more able to grow beyond the constraints of Singapore. And at the same time, we are also placing more emphasis on SMEs. So more support is being directed towards the SMEs in the way the schemes are designed. Details, we don't need to go into great detail, but the point is that we have paid attention to what SMEs need. Financing is one area that they're getting extra support. Infocom technologies, helping them to adopt infocom technologies to win for the long term. That is getting a huge boost. And of course, many of them are just beginning to become more aware of how they can benefit from productivity and innovation credit. So we have extended the scheme by 3 years and introduced something called PIC Plus that is aimed just at SMEs. So that's what's happening on the business front. Yeah.
For the layman, someone would say, how much more help do SMEs really need? You know, if they cannot stand on their own 2 feet, and again, it's a question that I am addressing to Victor, and it's a question I ask every year. How much more help? How much is enough, Victor? Sorry to put you on the spot.
I think firstly, if we look at the budget policy for the past few years, we could see this is a budget that's set in motion since 2010, and therefore there is since the Economic Strategy Committee looking at a whole 10-year plan, actually looks at how to move towards a growth-oriented and also a productivity-driven economy. So therefore we have seen the scheduled reduction of foreign workers, and also in terms of the rising of levies is in there. Just unfortunately that Singapore, the past few years of inflation is also quite high, the CPI index and all the rest. So businesses with the crosswind of the global context of the last few years, in America as well, Europe are not doing well. And secondly, Singapore is quite an open economy. It's a huge competition from Europe and America. When they come to Singapore, it's quite an open door for them to come in. And the third part, because of the inflation, that gives them some issues in there. So inevitably, I think we do see some of these micro enterprises, a good time or bad times, they will still have issues. But I want to actually do give a recognition that there was a broad base in this budget, a broad base leg up for everyone, especially in the ICT aspect. There was a part on about actually allowing SMEs to actually adopt broadband.
Indeed.
And therefore a leg up in terms of adopting pioneering ICT solutions. I think that will give some more competitive landscape, especially before 2015 when AEC come together as an ASEAN economic bloc.
You are listening to the Budget Forum 2014 on 938 Live. Our guests this evening, Senior Minister of State for Finance, Josephine Teo, Mr. Gerard Chairman at Council for the Third Age, and of course Victor Tay. Victor is the Chief Operating Officer at the Singapore Business Federation. We're going to come back and focus on the Pioneer Generation package. If it's up to scratch, is it enough? What more can be done? And what do you feel has been left out at all? And of course, we will talk about the increase in CPF rates, of course, Victor, and the PIC, and of course, if productivity is the way to go. You're listening to 938 Live. Back in just a moment.
938 Live. 938 Live gets you talking.
Welcome back into the Budget Forum 2014. I'm Keith de Souza. My guests this evening, Senior Minister of State for Finance, Josephine Teo, Mr. Gerard Chairman, Council for the Third Age, and of course Victor Tay. He's Chief Operating Officer at the Singapore Business Federation. Welcome back into Budget 2014, ladies and gentlemen. Lots to cover. Let's try and cut through all of this as best we can. We're talking about the Pioneer Generation. You know, it's a special package for this generation of Singaporeans, you know, those at least 65 years old this year and became citizens before 1987. From August, they can expect MediSave top-ups, $200 to $800 in their accounts annually. Older pioneers will receive larger lifelong top-ups, and from September, they'll pay half price at polyclinics and specialist outpatient clinics. That, we have to stress, is on top of existing subsidies at these places. And from next January, they automatically come under the Community Health Assist Scheme, and those with moderate to severe disabilities or their caregivers receive $1,200 annually under a disability assistance scheme. So, Mrs. Teo, 50% off at polyclinics and outpatient clinics. That's on top of existing subsidies. How did the government arrive at this discount, and how much can they save?
Okay.
You don't have to ask.
No, very important questions. But I think, again, just talking about the pioneer generation and what it is that we could do to honor their contributions, I think first point to recognize is that however we design the package, it can never fully reflect the depth of their contributions to our nation building. So this really attempts to look at an area that would be of greatest relevance to our pioneer generation. And I think the feedback has been very consistent. Please help us where healthcare is concerned. And when it comes to healthcare, it isn't just the hospitalization episodes, because not everyone eventually needs to end up in a hospital, whereas quite a number of seniors, especially those in our pioneer generation, feel the pressure of specialist treatments at outpatient settings, and even when they visit the general practitioners or go to the polyclinics. So that is the basis for thinking of the pioneer generation package in terms of the three areas of help that would be most relevant. So hospitalization, taking care of it through MediShield Life, which is still being designed.
Indeed.
And then taking care of it at the outpatient level, more support, whether it is at specialist outpatient clinics in public hospitals or polytechnics, or even at general practitioners that are part of the Community Health Assist program. So, of course, even if we were to be able to help with hospitalization episodes and outpatient care, we have to recognize that there will always be out-of-pocket expenses. And that is where the MediSave top-ups come in handy. They go into the MediSave accounts of the pioneer generation members, and there is more flexibility as to how these MediSave top-ups could be deployed. For some, it will be very useful towards in going towards help paying for MediShield Life premiums. For others, it could even go towards paying hospitalization bills. So that is the kind of design thinking when the pioneer generation package was being conceived.
So spreading the load more or less to the polyclinics and others, especially the GPs as well. Do you think our elderly have, at this particular point in time, have that access?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, there are already subsidies existing at polyclinics as well as specialist outpatient clinics. And as was also presented in this year's budget, those subsidies are being enhanced. So this pioneer generation package comes on top of that. It is quite an important point that you highlighted, which is whether our seniors will be able to access these services. In other words, making the subsidies available is one thing.
Precisely.
Yeah, but being able to access the services also requires a complementary effort on the part of the Ministry of Health to increase capacity. So you need to be able to provide the relevant services to the seniors, and you can only do so if you have sufficient healthcare workers. You also have the polyclinics located in the right places and so on. So the budget did not talk so much about it, but in the Committee of Supply debate, the Ministry of Health will give more details about what else they are doing to enhance healthcare affordability for all and make sure that it is accessible to all Singaporeans, including the pioneer generation members.
Okay, now we want to talk about the disabled. Mr. E, $1,200 for disabled pioneers or their caregivers. Were you hoping for more than the $1,200?
I think if you ask anyone, of course, the expectation always is for more. It can never be enough.
Free.
It's always a burden.
Right.
But I think the important thing is to know that they have not been forgotten. It's been addressed. Apart from that, you also look at the assistance given for the transport, including disabled people who can only commute by taxis. They're getting the subsidies for that as well. So I thought a sufficient thought at least was starters has been given for the disabled. And of course, more can always be done. But let's make a start, and I'm happy enough with the start that's been made.
Mrs. Teo, when I do a business program, the analysts will always say factor stuff in for inflation, given the current interest rates? It could be
Yes.
rising, it could be not. $200 to $800. Do you think this is enough of a buffer against inflation?
Well, it's a very good question and very relevant, even for our Pioneer Generation members. So I think the important commitment to bear in mind is that for the Pioneer Generation members aged 80 and above, the aim is to have enough in MediSave top-ups as well as premium subsidy, so that in effect the full sum of the MediShield Life premiums will be paid for. That is for those aged 80 and above. And then for those who are younger amongst the Pioneer Generation members, so for example, those that are age 50, the aim is to pay for about 50% of it. And that is a commitment. So we will have to take a look at what the committee that is studying the design of MediShield Life, what they come up with, what are their set of recommendations. But based on current plans, I think we have sized it to be sufficient.
So if I'm reading the signs correctly, $800 should cover the premiums. I'm just trying to poke into this. Next year, we don't know. I'm getting older as I speak. Yeah. Mr. E, do you think this helps to perhaps defray the costs, especially these top-ups, sufficient?
No, I think every bit goes a long way to help. But I think more importantly, seniors in general were a bit worried that because of the age cutoff, that they may miss out on the boat. But if you look at what has been introduced in the budget, very clearly their needs are also being addressed. As I said, the starting point, people are a bit over-concerned that all the emphasis is on the Pioneer package, but it didn't happen. Secondly, speaking to people, the concern is the cost of funding the Pioneer package. People are speculating how much is it going to cost, and there was speculation whether income tax rate would go up and things like that, and that didn't happen. And for younger generations, I think there's a peace of mind that a fund of $8 billion has been set aside, so they don't have to speculate anymore as to how the funding is going to be made.
And it's guaranteed no matter what.
That's exactly.
Right.
You know. So I think those, are, for me, are two very important points. One is we don't have to speculate about the funding, is there. And the other one is from the perspective of Council for the Third Age. It doesn't matter if you just miss the mark. There's quite a fair bit that's been done for seniors in general.
Need to ask, with all of this, are you at the Council of the Third Age, is there going to be a major outreach to people who perhaps, no matter what, and this message is not getting through?
Well, I think communication, public education, and making sure people interpret it is always very important. Most of us are so busy and we're headline readers and don't read the details about it. And I think it's worthwhile reiterating that the Pioneer package is an additional layer.
Very good point, actually. I also want to reinforce what Gerard was talking about, which is that when we talk about healthcare affordability, the aim is to have healthcare affordability for all Singaporeans. And what we do for the Pioneer Generation package comes on top of the efforts that are being made for other Singaporeans. And why that is important is because the Pioneer Generation members really spent their productive lives at a stage of development for Singapore where wages were still very low. So that means that their savings are also correspondingly much lower than what we are able to achieve in today's context. So that takes special recognition of the very unique circumstances that they, operated within.
Give illustration in point. Just now you mentioned 50%, but it's 50% on top of 50%. So actually they're getting 75%.
Okay.
It takes an accountant to get that immediately.
Of course, in a previous life.
Thank you.
It's not 50%.
You're listening to the Budget Forum 2014 on 938 Live. I'm going to take a short break. Join us after the headline news for part 2 and 3 of this discussion. My guests this evening, Senior Minister of State for Finance, Josephine Teo, Mr. Gerard E., Chairman at the Council for the Third Age, and Victor Tay, Chief Operating Officer at the Singapore Business Federation. He's been very quiet this segment. I promise to put you to more use when we come back. Keep it right here on 938 Live.
938 Live gets you talking.
You're listening to 938 Live's Budget Forum 2014. I'm Keith de Souza. Before we go into what we are talking about, the CPF contributions. Now, the budget's been described as one focusing on achieving quality growth and building a fair and equitable society. With us in the studio this evening, our Senior Minister of State for Finance, Josephine Teo, Mr. Gerard, who is Chairman at Council for the Third Age, and of course, Victor Tay, Chief Operating Officer at the Singapore Business Federation. We want to talk about the special package again, but Mr. You want me to emphasize that you heard in the news it says 50% off, but that is not entirely the full story, is it?
Yeah, no, because the Pioneer Package is an additional layer. So even before the Pioneer Package, the increase in subsidy for seniors is already applied. So on top of that, you're talking about 50% off, additional 50%. So it's a total of 75% off. When you look at it from the correct perspective, that is very generous.
And I have to, from a line that the minister said, it takes an accountant to know the nitty-gritty. Now, earlier in the show, like we said, we discussed this package, and which includes lower premiums, MediShield Life, top-ups to MediSave, and extra subsidies for outpatient bills. Now, to help Singaporeans cope with rising healthcare costs, employer CPF contribution rates to MediSave will be raised by 1 percentage point from the start of next year. That's on top of an increase in CPF contribution rates for older workers between half and 1 percentage points. Mrs. Teo, how will this increase, help Singaporeans with their rising healthcare costs, support older workers, right, and to stay in the workforce? Yes. What kind of thinking or consideration went into this, seriously?
Yes. Actually very important, because we must remember that for the older workers, in fact, their CPF contribution rates were reduced a number of years ago. And there was a commitment made to eventually restore the CPF contribution rates for those aged between 50 to 55. So this is part of that restoration. Some steps were taken before, and this is a continuation of that. Mm-hmm. So then, to put it into context, the whole purpose of having CPF is to ensure retirement adequacy. In other words, each one of us saves during the years in which we are working, so that when we eventually decide to stop work, we are able to draw on a pool of savings. But the assumptions,
minimum sum aside. That's
right, yeah. And the assumptions that were used to compute the needs, those have to be adjusted as evidence presents itself. And one of the evidences that has presented itself is longevity. The length to which people are living is not the same as when we first started the CPF scheme. And even in the years before, where CPF was reviewed and the policies were designed, the parameters were fixed, those things will have to be relooked when new evidence presents itself, especially with regards to longevity. So part of building that retirement adequacy, especially for seniors already above 50, there is a need to boost their savings in CPF, and so this is part of that move.
Before we get the views of Victor and the business fraternity, Mr. what are your views on this?
No, I think many of us think that we can manage our own funding, our own savings, but I think there's enough evidence to show that that's not quite true. And many of us do benefit from compulsory savings. The flexibility and the use of CPF, where people are allowed to use it for investments and all that, has spelled extreme pain for certain individuals itself. No, I think it makes sense to have some form of compulsory saving, and it's really really your nest egg for the future. If you look at for the lower income, lower contributors, in today's environment, assuming you take home more of the money, how can you save? What are you going to put it in? Fixed deposit interest rates?
0.2%?
Even in CPF, clearly you're benefiting from it, and it's safe. You don't worry about the bank going bust and things like that.
What we're worried about is, do you think this will help retain older workers in the workforce?
To me, I've always held the view, and I've seen many employers who literally bend backwards to retain employees way beyond retirement age because they are a major contributor to the company. And there are employees where the employers are quite happy they have reached retirement age because they're just done, they have started winding down a few years before retirement, and every individual has to decide for themselves. And it is not some magic thing by legislation. And if you can show that you're contributing, I believe a good employer will want to retain you.
Victor, how open are businesses to hiring older workers?
Well, firstly, we conducted a survey, national business survey annually in Singapore Business Federation. We found out that actually small and medium enterprises hire more senior workers than their MNCs. The statistics came about 27% of the entire SME staff cohort is actually, so every 1 in 4 is actually senior workers above 50 years old. Whereas for MNC, it's about 16%, and therefore that means around every 1 in 6. So in this case, the small medium enterprises actually cherish the older workers, and in this case, especially, I think a healthy worker is actually a productive worker to them. Absolutely. So therefore, they support that. Before the budget announcement, there were calls that for the 50 to 55 years old, that there could be actually increment of CPF around 3 to 5%. That time around, I think some of them might felt that, especially in a high inflationary environment, this come too fast, too soon. Mm-hmm. And second part, I think in the tight labor employment market, I think this may also have rendered some of them become uncompetitive versus the younger ones. So I guess when with this announcement, we saw the 50 to 55 years old is actually a 1 percentage point increment for the CPF, and then for the 55 years old to 65 years old, actually it's only 0.5%. So therefore, they had actually graduated this and ensured that there are some competitiveness between the two different age group. Generally, businesses are supportive of this.
Now, how much is this going to add on to business costs? And the question has to be asked, will this disadvantage the Singapore worker?
Well, Keith, if I may respond on this point, I think it is a relevant concern, and we don't take it lightly that this does add to the costs of operating in Singapore. But I should also say that having recognized this, we had already introduced something called the Seniors Employment Credit.
Okay.
In other words, the message to employers is very clear. If you retain seniors in your workforce, if you employ them, then what the government is prepared to do is to help you offset some of the costs of doing so. So the Seniors Employment Credit, in fact, can go all the way up to 8% of the wages of the seniors that is being employed. Now, given that we already have this scheme in place, and now that we are adjusting the employers' contribution rates, CPF contribution rates for senior workers, what we will also do is to offset this cost increase for the employers by adding up to 0.5 percentage points to the Seniors Employment Credit that the employers can get. And then we are also going to have a temporary employment credit, so that in the first year, certainly, the cost increase for the employers is actually going to be quite marginal.
You know, productivity is the name of the game in this budget and the previous budgets as well. Back to the older workers, although we sing their praises, how much productivity can we raise if businesses keep hiring older workers? Victor, if you'd like to Can you raise your productivity with the older workforce?
Well, we have companies examples who actually tell us that the older workers, which are actually veteran workers, they come with a lifetime of experience. That lifetime experience help companies to actually cut short their process of trying to resolve problems, challenges. They do not have to actually reinvent the wheels. A lot of this experience can be borrowed. And they come from, some of the senior workers come from MNC, multinationals. So some of these templates can be easily borrowed and implemented within SMEs. So I guess it really depends on how SMEs and also the entrepreneurs look at the senior workers. At the current tight employment market right now, I think any single warm bodies is considered productive.
Hear that, listeners? Any warm body right now is needed. Now,
but with all due respect, Keith, I think we must challenge the assumption behind the statement that you made.
Which is?
Or the question that you posed to Victor, which is it possible to improve productivity when you hire senior workers? That it suggests to me that the assumption behind it is that when you are senior, you are definitely less productive. I think a lot of seniors will take offense with that.
Yeah.
And I personally disagree with that. I fully support what Victor was saying earlier. There are employers who value seniors for the rich experience and for their temperament, for their willingness to listen and their ability to look at problems with a different lens than the value that a young person brings to the job. So I think we must have a culture in Singapore where we don't look at the value of an individual ability to contribute and say that, because of your age, then automatically it will be less, or because of your gender, or because of your ethnic group. I think we must not have any of this kind of biases, and it's best that we operate from the point of view that every single employee can bring value, and it's up to us to create the environment that they are engaged and they enjoy working and they want to give of their best. That is, I think, something that we have to work towards.
I think
words to live by, and I stand chastised.
Oh dear, I don't mean that at all, Keith.
Yes, Mr. Lee,
Not at all.
If I heard correctly, I think DPN Taman mentioned very briefly continuing education, but didn't expand on it. On lifelong training and continuing education. I think that's very important because with economic restructuring, the skill sets that's required is constantly changing, and assistance certainly has to be given for people to keep on upgrading themselves. Then, no matter how old you are, you remain always with that potential to contribute.
Yeah, I suppose I want to add on that perhaps, Keith, your anger comes from the fact that some of the perspective comes from the part that a lot of times I think the senior workers actually comes with peripheral inconvenience of their family, which means that a lot of them are homemakers. Therefore, they have decided to come out and do part-time. And so sometimes businesses has to adjust their timing just for some of these homemakers who had a certain timing have to go back home to look after children, grandchildren, and all the rest. But we have a few successful case studies where retail companies actually adjust their time to suit some of these workers. And on top of that, the PMAT, especially those who are experienced PMAT coming from multinationals, that comes with a lifetime experience, as I said. And I think many SMEs cherish that, and actually they borrow those experience, so that gives them a leg up to be competitive.
Having said that, I do think that there are occasions where our seniors face the prospects of not being able to get a job of their liking because some employers do not think that they're up to it. I hope that as a society we will challenge these assumptions.
Let's move on to the Productivity and Innovation Credit Scheme. Now, it's been extended, like we said earlier, for another 3 years, especially to cater to SMEs again. Just yesterday, the Trade Ministry said labour productivity was flat in 2013, although better than the decline in the year before. Mr. Steele, do you think the extension and enhancement of the PIC scheme would be enough, perhaps, to reach 2 to 3% annual productivity growth, say by 2020?
Well, just as a technical point, to look at productivity on a year-to-year basis is not always meaningful. And even to look at it on a 5-year basis, it depends on which 5 years you choose, because some years you happen to start from a low base, and then some years it happens to be in a high base. But putting aside all that technicalities, if you look at productivity improvements since maybe we started the restructuring journey in 2010, actually productivity has improved by 11% across the board. But or actually I should say it's 11% economy-wide. It's not across the board because in some sectors the improvements have been higher, some other sectors are lagging. But we have to acknowledge that the reason this productivity growth seen over a 4-year time frame is actually quite respectable at 11% is really because there was a strong cyclical recovery in 2010. But after that 2010 cyclical recovery, there has been far less improvement, and that's why we need to do something more to boost that productivity movement. So the PIC enhancements is seen in that context. We are still at the early stages of a multi-year journey. It will take us quite some time to get there. Businesses are just getting used to the idea. When we first started this journey, the call was really, can we not do it? But I think we have crossed that hurdle, and many more businesses are now familiar with what they need to do to raise productivity and to introduce more innovation in the way they operate. It's a good momentum. We ought to be able to build it up further and to create the environment where productivity, skills, innovation is just pervasive. It just becomes a part of a way of life, a way of operating in Singapore. We are not there yet.
There has been a criticism, which we also discussed earlier, that the PIC scheme is easier for the MNCs because of their size and their economy of scale to take advantage of it rather than the SMEs. Is this borne out, Victor?
We did a survey, the National Business Survey, and we found that among the respondents, 1,000 over of them, 49% of the multinationals actually found the PICs in the array of even WCS good schemes to actually help them to defray business costs. Whereas when we conversely look at SMEs, there were only just 29% who felt that it helps them to defray those costs. And I guess if we analyze it deeper, because PIC is a tax incentives in 6 categories that were very well thought of, from upskilling workers, training, research, intellectual properties onwards. And some of this actually belongs to a larger companies that were able to do this with the skill of it. And the other part of it is it's a profitable companies that will benefit from tax incentives. And the last part, I think, for instance, schemes like WCS goes by the number of workers that you have, and therefore you benefit from the 40%.
I believe it's 3 workers, you have more than 3 workers, and you could benefit from it.
Yes, and I guess there was also qualified that the small enterprises must have at least 3 workers. And I think some of the family-run businesses, the workers are also the directors or shareholders, and that could not be qualified. So I think there's a gap in there. And so some of them actually did make comments that it was actually benefiting the larger enterprises. But to measure productivity and actually use PIC as a proxy to measure that, I think that's probably not right. What I mean is PIC at most is a catalyst to actually tip over businesses' ability to say, I want to do productivity oriented activities. With or without this, many businesses understand that because with the constraint of workers, you have no choice but to move towards productivity. And a lot of them understand that by 2015, when we open up the whole economic zone in ASEAN, their competition coming from overseas. If you are not innovating, then there's a problem. And therefore, I think with or without the schemes, many businesses understand they have to move towards productivity and quality growth.
I know, Mrs. Teo, you said that it could be better the PIC. But is the government happy with the take-up rate thus far? You said it was a slow start currently?
Well, I would say that it's fair to recognize that smaller businesses naturally feel more challenged when it comes to accessing these schemes. They don't have people who are working on, finance or certain aspects of their businesses on a full-time basis. They have people who are double-hatting, triple-hatting, and so on. I think we recognize that. And so I think we've done everything possible to make the scheme as easy to use as possible. So far, I would say that the take-up rate is quite encouraging. If you look at SMEs with turnover of more than 1 million, which is not terribly big because many in the trading and the wholesale type of businesses easily will be able to exceed $1 million. Actually, 2 out of 3 of those SMEs have benefited from PIC. They have claimed and they have been given payouts. Now, is 2 out of 3 enough? I think this is where I think Victor made a good point. These are just schemes that catalyze change in behavior among businesses. They are there as supportive measures. No amount of schemes and grants and incentives can replace the enthusiasm and the passion of the business owners and the people that they hire to try and reinvent their businesses or to take it to a different level. So the schemes, I think we recognize their value, but I think we can also not overemphasize their place in the whole transformation of our economy. What is equally, if not more important, is the willingness of businesses to reinvent themselves, the willingness of the owners as well as their entire teams to say, look, we cannot operate the way we used to. We have to challenge ourselves to go beyond our comfort zone, and there are opportunities out there, and if we apply ourselves, if we put our minds to it, then we open up whole new vistas for the business. And we are seeing people who have that sort of very positive energy. And the whole idea is that you want to encourage these kinds of businesses, help them to go as far as possible.
Trying to move on now to Infocom technology and how SMEs can leverage on this to improve productivity. There's an initiative by the government. You're going to subsidize 70% of the cost of ICT products and services. How will this program actually boost their productivity, Mrs. Teo?
Well, I think especially for small businesses, resource constraints are a daily reality. So if resource constraints are a daily reality, then how do you help businesses to overcome it? And many of the solutions now exist through heavy, intense use of Infocom technologies. But there are also obstacles faced by businesses. For example, they need to be able to use cloud services. Okay. And that means that they need to be on the broadband. And that means sometimes equipment. And that means also paying for subscription, and so all of these are costs. And in the meantime, they may not realize the benefits of introducing these ICT solutions. So where this scheme comes in is to say that, okay, let's see how we can help you if you're willing to put in the investments to get yourself onto Infocom platforms, Infocom technologies, introduce them into your businesses. This is how we want to come in and give you a boost. Now, not all businesses will be able to use ICT equally. I think there are some that are already very smart, already very savvy. They will be the early adopters, and they will lead the way. They will show how it is done, and then you will have other people who realize that actually it is not as hard as they imagined. You always need those first few early adopters, and they are the pioneers. And I like to say that every generation has its own pioneers, and I think certainly amongst our SMEs we will also see new pioneers.
Now, the construction industry, I would like to ask Victor's views, but in the time that we have left, I have to put this to Mrs. Teo. The construction companies, there's a mandate for them to use productive technologies in certain government land sale sites, obviously to improve productivity. They're one of the poorest in this field. What are the productive technologies the government is seeking from them?
Well, where construction is concerned, actually, we are doing two things. One is that you need to move upstream. You can't wait till the point of construction to introduce measures that will improve the use of manpower. By the time the building is designed, and by the time you have already started building, it's already too late. You actually have to do it much earlier. Even at the point of conceptualization, you have to think of how can we build in a more labor-saving way. So the idea is to move upstream. Now then, at the same time, what we are also saying is that there are construction workers that are better skilled and they are better experienced. Actually, what you want to do is to retain more of their skills, more of their experience, because that will improve productivity as a whole. So you will see some changes, some targeted changes in the foreign worker levy policy to try and encourage this sort of retention of skills and experience. And then, in terms of the productive technologies, the jargon, the technical term is buildability and constructability. But actually, I think, the easiest way to think of it is that if you can build it like a Lego set.
Okay.
It doesn't take...
Prefabbed.
Well, maybe not prefab only. Prefab is one of the ways.
Right.
But build in such a way that actually it is very efficient. It doesn't take a great complex work in order to achieve the building design. Then I think you will be able to see much greater improvements in productivity for the construction sector. It will be upgraded. So that is the direction that we're trying to move towards.
The short answer for this next question, Mrs. Teo, does this not mean that the larger developers will be able to take advantage of this scheme because of their bigger budgets and their capacity?
I think actually that is not the most important question. I think if you look at Singapore, even though we are actually already very developed, there is still a very large number of projects where infrastructure is concerned, where healthcare, amenities, facilities are concerned that are still being built. So you have all these projects that have to take place because we are continuing to transform our island physically. And so that actually presents an opportunity for us to ask a smart question. Can we build more efficiently? Can we build more smartly? And if you look at actually even just amongst contracts that are given out by the government, the assumption is that it's always the big contractors that get it. I will talk more about this during COS, but the evidence actually is that SME contractors are getting quite a lot of work too. So I don't see this as necessarily benefiting one group or the other. What it should really benefit is the construction sector in Singapore.
Say you will come and talk to me about this on my program.
If you invite me, of course.
I will. Your invitation is always there. I know we're running a little bit of time in the couple of seconds that we have left. Mr. E, your final thoughts on the budget?
Well, I'm very encouraged in the picture that's been painted. Now I eagerly await for the details at the Committee of Supply, healthcare from the Minister of Health and so forth. And it is really the details that sounds promising.
Victor?
Well, the business committee heave a sigh of relief. There's no further regulatory burden that's put on it, except construction, perhaps a defined way about design and buildability. I think most of the progressive and productive companies actually welcome the ICT adoption, the PIC Plus, the extension of PIC for another 3 years is a good news to them.
Mrs. Teo, happy that the business community is happy?
Well, I would say that if you look at Budget 2014 overall, if there is nothing else that you remember, just remember two things. It provides greater assurance for our seniors, and it helps to build opportunities for the future. And if the business sector is happy and the people sector is happy, then I think we've done a reasonable job, I hope.
On that note, we've come to the end of Budget Forum 2014. We'd like to thank our guests this evening, Senior Minister of State for Finance, Josephine Teo, Mr. Gerard who's Chairman at Council for the Third Age, and Victor Tay. He's the Chief Operating Officer at the Singapore Business Federation. I'm Keith de Souza. Have a great evening.
Thank you.